I want to talk about something that I think is very misunderstood, not only by doctors, but patients, and that is how AI is affecting medicine. A lot of patients just think that they're just outsourcing thinking to AI. They think everything is getting more computerized and how doctors are just going to be looking at algorithms and not really taking care of patients and just relying on these algorithms. On the doctor side, too, there's a lot of fear that AI is going to start taking people's jobs, rightfully, because if all the decisions are being made by AI, then what is the point of having a doctor? Obviously, there are some fields that are more procedure heavy that would take a little more time to take over, but there's a lot of fear of both of those things happening. And in this video, I'm going to actually talk about how I use AI not only to make me a better doctor, but also more human and be able to interact with patients better. So it's really hard to have this conversation about how AI benefits medicine without talking about one of the biggest issues that we're dealing with right now. And that is access to care, how much of a mental load doctors now have just documenting, putting things together. And there's a huge amount of medicine that has to do with charting, dealing with insurance companies, dealing with social work, and a lot of people completely just burn out to the point where if you look at the statistics of burnout, I'm an OBGYN, which is one of the most physically demanding fields because of the hours that we have waking up in the middle of the night. When you look at the burnout rates of internal medicine, which tends to have more steady hours, yes, they work very hard, but they typically are not up every night going back and forth to work. Their burnout rates are about the same as OBGYNs. And a big part of that is because of the amount of stress of documentation. So going through residency, for example, when I was going through my internal medicine rotations, we would literally go around, see patients, and most of the day was literally rounding and putting in notes. And the notes had to be in excruciating detail, and it was mind-numbing to the point I told myself I could never do it. I actually originally went into medicine to keep people healthy. I thought about going into primary care, and I ended up hating it and going into OBGYN because I felt like I could do those intangible things like keep people healthy, but also deal with the tangibles like deliver babies, do surgery. It was more balanced for me and actually was a lot more sane than how most of these internal medicine doctors run their day in the hospital, running around just patching people up. And none of us went into residency to be a doctor, to just sit behind a desk and just write notes for most of our day. It is a huge cognitive burnout, and it really, really has pushed a lot of people away from medicine. So this leads me into the first main thing on how I use AI, which is starting to become a lot more popular. And that isn't to think for me, it's to scribe for me. Many of these medical records, for example, I have ECW, there's one called Suno, I know Epic has one. There's a bunch of them that will now allow us to, instead of just sitting there typing, I'm sure anyone who's a patient or in any situation has been to the office where you walk in and they're just sitting there typing on their desks, not even making eye contact, just putting information in the computer. Imagine now you go to the doctor's office and you sit down and the doctor actually looks you in the face and starts talking to you. And when we talk about what makes a good physician, my dad's also an OB/GYN and I practice it with him. He would always make this distinction. There's a difference between a physician and a doctor. A physician is someone that not only knows information, it's someone that truly cares for a patient. And that is being there for them physically, emotionally, and just making them feel heard and caring for them as a human being, not as just another number. So imagine instead of that situation where you go into a room and the doctor is just typing and getting that information, imagine instead they sit down and they actually look at you and talk to you. And when you think about what that entails as far as ability to pick up things on a history and physical exam, when you're actually talking to someone, making eye contact with someone, you're able to actually be there with someone. The amount of energy you bring into the room, the way you're able to make a patient feel calm and actually cared for, I think really makes a difference in patient care. Uh, on the point of how you're able to make the patient feel, but also if you're able to make someone feel more calm and cared for, they open up more. You also pick up on subtle cues. If I'm talking to someone about, for example, I'm taking a social history, sexual history, a lot of times people are very reserved on what they tell you. But sometimes if your head is just, imagine, behind a computer screen, you lose subtle cues. You're not able to get as full of the history as you want to, or even realize, because there's a huge barrier between you and your patient, which is like a computer just sitting there, and it kind of blocks connection. And this was, I think, the first thing that really changed. And on the personal side, I'm very dyslexic. It was very hard for me getting through medical school and undergrad, eventually becoming a doctor, because of my like personal hardships, specifically like reading and writing. And the blessing for me there is that it made me a very quick early adopter to these technologies. So for me, I've always been able to use technology to kind of leverage those things. I was a very early adopter in doing this, and I found my quality of life and my ability to take care of patients was a lot higher. So imagine now I talk to you, I'm spending time with you, I'm getting your history, I'm able to actually be there with you, examine you, and in the background, the AI is just formulating the note and putting everything together. That is a huge time saver. When I'm done with seeing a patient, I review it and then it's done and I'm able to move on to the next patient. So that really helps me be there for the patient in that visit, but also something else that patients may not realize that suffer is when we're moving quickly, we either write a note then and there, which tends to not be as full and thorough, especially if we have a busy schedule, or we write it after the office. Imagine what gets missed after a full day in the office seeing so many patients and you're trying to finish your notes. And some doctors will actually spend hours after the office just trying to catch up on the workload. And in this way, I'm able to do it quickly. I'm able to spend more time with patients because I don't need to allocate that time for writing. I just have to review and move over. So personally, it's been very helpful for someone. I think the people who have a hard time tend to adopt things earlier. So for me, I was probably the first person in my practice to start adopting it. But now it's gotten to the point that I've been able to get my other partners on board and they've found it to be unbelievably helpful. And thus far, I think scribing has been the number one use case that I've had so far, but it goes deeper than that. For me too, this is not a plug for them. I don't really work with them or get affiliated with them, but there is a app called Doximity. They also have a website, and I'm letting you guys know about this because it's free for doctors and for medical professionals to use. And that app allows you, number one, to make phone calls to your patients and it goes to the office. It also allows you to scribe HIPAA compliant, and it has an AI that is also HIPAA compliant. And because I know a lot of people, if you're, let's say, you're a medical student or a resident, or you don't have access to these other AIs, this is a free AI that is given to you through this company, and I think that's absolutely amazing. So if you're someone that wanted to get into this, but you thought you didn't have access, Doximity is free. It's on your phone. You just have to apply for it. And it's completely HIPAA compliant. I would also urge you to look at the states, like the state that you're in, what their policies are, because that can change what you're allowed to do and you're not allowed to do. The other things that I use it for is, in our practice, we do our own ultrasounds. So I dictate the ultrasounds to the AI and it gives me a full report. And there's other fun things you can do, which is when you're dictating and for example, let's say I'm dictating and I'm talking about an ovarian mass, I'll explain the ovarian mass, and what it'll do is, instead of manually doing something, for example, like an ORAD score, which is a type of scoring system to give me a percent chance that something is cancer and also when to follow up, it'll automatically do the scoring for me based off the description that I give it. So it's another huge time saver, and it also gives me a quick, easy way to tell patients when to follow up on whatever we're seeing. And this is where it starts getting where people start getting a little more on edge about. But another way that I think is very interesting is using it as a thought partner. So imagine, as doctors, we're human beings. We're only able to make a certain amount of connections, like together. They say between 3 and 7 things we can hold in your brain at one time. And the classic example is, if you think about a car with 4 clowns. 3 clowns are wearing a green hat, 1 is wearing a red hat. At some point around there, that is how many details you can put together. An AI does not have that issue. It also has infinite knowledge. Again, people will talk about how it hallucinates, but remember, we're not using this to replace us, we're using this to help think with us. So another way I like to use it is as a thought partner. And I'll give you an example. Let's say I'm talking to a patient, and let's say they have endometriosis, and I'm going over treatment plans. Every doctor, regardless of how experienced they are, we tend to have things we like to do, and we also have ways we like to do that. So there's, for example, specific treatments. Let's say I take abnormal uterine bleeding. Let's say someone's bleeding a lot and we need to stop the bleeding. And I want to, usually the treatment plan is, let's say we give them a birth control taper to stop the bleeding, and I explain to them how it works. There's different ways to do that. And let's say I'm currently in my head, I'm moving quickly. You could use AI as a thought partner. You can ask it, what are the other possible treatment plans based off this information? And I'm going to go into how to do this a little better, but it'll then give you 3 or 4 different options, which again, you could obviously just go on to like your professional website for us as ACOG, and it'll give you the different options, but it'll pull it up for you. And does that mean you should use that as a treatment choice? Not necessarily, but the way I think about it is, imagine you now have you're an attending doctor. Instead of seeing patients by yourself, you have now 3 or 4 residents pitching and giving them your opinion. You as the attending doctor, or like the head person, still needs to make that decision, but sometimes it's nice to open your horizons to be able to make better decisions for that patient. Just because I like to do something one way doesn't mean it's best for the patient. They may want something else, but if, for example, it doesn't come to mind at that second, you may forget to offer it to them. And I think it's really good at fail-safing and giving people more options in what they do. Another interesting thing that happens too is, if we take this example of abnormal bleeding, if I tell patients, okay, there's X and Y side effects, I expect bleeding, 70% of people stop bleeding after like 3 days or whatever. When we're giving that information, patients forget what to do and how to take it. You can then turn that note, that information that you scribed, into something like patient education. And then you can then print or send the patient a personalized treatment plan based on what they're doing. Every patient that's been to the hospital has gotten these discharge instructions that you feel like sometimes they weren't even made for you, because they're very non-specific and had nothing to do with what you're doing. And then at the bottom, it'll just say whatever the doctor said to do. Imagine everything in that treatment plan was very specific, explaining what your conditions are and what you're doing. And AI can put that all together for you. Again, you still need to oversight. People really criticize it because it makes some mistakes. But if you think about it as, imagine you have a resident working under you, you don't say the resident is broken. You use that information to help put things together better. And it provides a more seamless, positive experience, not only for you, but also for the patient, which is incredible. So I think it's really a win-win on both sides. And this goes back to what I was starting at before. While all this medical stuff is happening, while all the secretarial stuff happens, because imagine if I had to hire a scribe and it's like $50,000, $60,000 to be doing all this, it'll be less efficient. You have another person in the room. This just all gets done. And during all that time, you have that running in the background, and the doctor is looking at you, talking to you, and connecting with you, being able to be there more for you. Because one of the biggest complaints, if you look at the polls online from patients from their doctors, is that they don't listen and they don't pay attention. And I think satisfaction rates go way up. And I think we actually become better doctors just by paying attention. And also imagine you have all that background behind you. And when you think of too, like, there's a lot of health deserts in this country. If you go to like the middle of, let's say, some rural areas, there's a huge like missing access of health. So I'm imagining in the future, using AI or using telehealth would greatly increase access to patients. And also imagining doctors who, for example, do not have a specific skill set. Let's say you're an emergency room doctor, it may be able to help guide you through. And I think those things still need to be built out, but I think there's going to be a huge access to that part. And if you want to think crazy more in the future, if they had a robot trained on how to deal with emergency situations, and a doctor can talk to them, have their eyes there, touch almost like a Da Vinci robot. I think that's gonna really change access, and it'll also globalize things. But again, this is just my crazy fantasies about the future. On the doctor side, I kinda mentioned this before, is burnout is real, and it really cuts down hours of your job. When you come in and, like, I'm imagining in residency, the amount of time I spent okay, so I went to residency at the community hospital here at Jackson Memorial Hospital. The amount of work we had to do that was not medical. The amount of work that was, for example, I had a patient that her 6th or 7th kid, they have no access to health, like care in general, and you want to get them, let's say, an IUD so they only get pregnant if they want to. We would spend hours of our time, a day sometimes, just appealing, trying to get grants for an IUD to get that patient into the office, and then half the time they wouldn't come. It was literally mind-numbing to be able to sit there, try to get patients care and not be able to help them. And a lot of the barriers were not even medical, they were social work. And a lot of times we would get stuck in that situation and not be able to help people. And that was really, really sad and hard. But as residents, imagine I would get there at 4:15 in the morning and I would leave, I don't know, like if it was a day shift around 8 p.m. We're spending a huge amount of hours of the day instead of learning, just trying to put paperwork together. And I think a lot of that could be alleviated through a lot of this AI stuff. And in the office now, I think there's going to be a huge, right? Like a lot of patients don't realize this, that they wonder why things are so expensive. Imagine they're complaining about the copay, the amount that things cost, how insurance works. I think moving forward, it's starting to happen already. AI will help figure a lot of that stuff out. About 25% of our healthcare costs in this country is just figuring out how insurance works. We have we're 4 doctors in our practice. We have 3 people whose only job in our office is to try to get insurance to pay and also, like, fight denials for whatever reason. And I think having AI eventually work in the back end to at least just process denials and get things paid appropriately would also be a burnout. There's a huge, if you look across the country, private practices are diminishing and diminishing because of the burnout from the administrative load. And we've been losing a lot of autonomy. Like, I'm very blessed that I'm in a private practice that is sustaining, but the loads of just billing, office management work is getting harder. And another cool thing I think in the future that'll be really interesting is if they had an AI checker on the notes. A big part of big strange thing in this country is, obviously this is in the US, that you don't own your medical information. The medical records do. So for example, in our practice, we use ECW. That doesn't necessarily talk to Epic. And when we get records scanned in, they're in a completely different section. I have to go through the scanned documents and things don't talk to each other. And the more friction there is before information, the more potential chances of things being missed are. And that obviously as a patient is bad for your care. And I think it's important to realize there that imagine if everything just talked to each other. And if it didn't, you had an AI in the records that would also pull everything together, put everything in a format that would be easily to be seen. And also, if there's something missing, it could prompt you, like almost like an assistant, for 2 reasons. For billing, they're like, hey, you forgot to fill out this part of the note, so it doesn't get declined. But also as almost a checker saying, okay, this patient talked about these things. You may want to follow up on X, Y, and Z. Because also in the American system, healthcare is very fragmented. So my ability to do endocrinology or urology as a OBGYN, we have some basic knowledge. It may help save patients time and energy bouncing back and forth because we'd be able to streamline processes, which would also, again, like I talked about earlier, if you're in a rural area where you don't have as much access to care, you'll be able to expand every doctor's capabilities and provide better care for patients so they're not bounced back and forth and back and forth. I just want to recap what I think is really important. So where I think this is going, and just to kind of recap of what I talked about here, is AI is here to help us. I think there's a lot of fear built off of it, but what I really think it'll allow us to do is to connect with, as doctors, to our patients on a more human level, expand our ability to treat you. And it'll also, I think, start eliminating a lot of medical errors and medical gaps that are happening in this country. I think it'll make us fully human, fully engaged, and just more human being able to connect instead of dealing with all these barriers of computers and a whole medical system that has really got in the way between providers and their patients. And I really think that's what medicine needs right now, and I think it's the way of the future, and I'm hoping it leads to better care.